Well, chapter 25, we're going to cover commercial property insurance. Some of you will probably not be directly employed with the insurance industry, but if you ever want to become a business owner, self-employed, entrepreneur, even if you're a manager in any organization, you're probably going to have to understand the basics of commercial property and commercial liability policies, which I'll cover in chapter 26. Let me move over to my screen. Hopefully it will share correctly at this point. And see if it's going to show up for you. Okay, commercial property. I'm going to speed through this again. I'm going to cover the highlights, but make sure you take a look at the chapter or reach out to me if you have any specific questions. So first thing I'll mention is, as a business owner or manager, you don't want to have to go out and buy individual policies. Although in my organization, a little bit larger and more complex, and the larger the organization, more complex, you can go out and buy policies separately. So I buy one for property, I buy one for, we'll cover in a minute, directors and officers, I buy a separate one for work comp. But let's say you're a smaller business and you want to buy just something that bundles everything together. Just give me everything I need. A package policy is a really good way to go. Essentially what it's called, a commercial package policy. What does it mean? It's got 2 or more coverages included. It's got to at least have that in a single policy. So it's going to have all the different coverages bundled together. We call that a multi-line policy, meaning that it has more than one thing in it. Monoline policies only have one type of coverage. So you would get a separate one for property, a separate one for liability coverages. The advantage of having a package policy is usually it's cheaper. Secondly, it prevents having gaps. So which policy is going to cover, you'll at least know that it's all should be packaged into one. And that way, if something isn't covered in one, it's going to be covered in the other that's within the same bundle. So property coverage, it does have we're going to talk only about the bundled package policies that are out there. We call the basic one that's most common for small businesses would be a building and personal property coverage, a BPP coverage form. It includes your commercial property coverage. It's going to have something for your personal property. So it's going to cover more than just buildings. It's going to be the contents of your buildings and a few other coverages that are there, including business interruption and expense. It does cover, like I said, any specific locations you mentioned. So it's going to name, like if we have 45 locations and then we have substations, every one of those has to be in my declarations page. It's got to have the addresses. If it's not listed, unless it's a new purchase, it's not going to be covered. At those specific locations, it's going to cover your fixtures that are permanently installed, any machinery or equipment. We call that personal property. Things that are inside computers, furniture, things of that sort. So coverages that are included in a BPP policy typically are, what is my own interest? What do I own? First of all, I think you recall from early on in this chapter, this semester, we talked about you can't insure something that you don't have rights to insure. So assuming you own the property, you can't just take out a policy on somebody else's property. It has to be your own and you've rights to it. Any improvements you make, any betterments, you could take one out on a rental if you're a tenant, as long as it only covers those things that you're responsible for. It also is going to cover property that you, like maybe someone brings in a piece of machinery to be fixed at your business. Anything that's in your care, custody, and control. So let's say you drop off something to be fixed, like your car or some other piece of equipment. While it's in your possession, it's going to cover the loss of that equipment. Let's say that there's a fire while you have people's equipment on site. Some additional things that a personal BP or a commercial BPP policy is going to cover is debris removal. Now that doesn't sound like a lot. If you have a major fire and you have this shell left, somebody's going to have to pick up and clean up all the debris. And actually it's pretty expensive. Just to give you perspective, we have a over $1 billion piece of property sitting at one of our power stations. So it's a very large expense if we lost it. but just to remove the debris associated with that particular asset, it's in excess of $30 million. So it's not cheap, and that's going to be covered. If you ever have a fire or you're trying to contain it and you actually have to spend money to preserve additional losses from occurring, like maybe you have to put a tarp up if you have a hole in the roof, and you want to prevent water damage, it's going to cover different costs that you incur. So under certain conditions, your insurance can be extended to cover other property, things that like your personal effects of your employees or anything new that you acquire. Those are always good to have. You guys remember from early chapters, we talked about co-insurance. That means if you have a piece of property that's valued at $500,000, you at least have to carry 80% of it, if that's what your policy says, of the value in limits. You can't underinsure it. And we're not going to go through that exercise just today, just to understand that you have a certain minimum amount you have to insure it for. Otherwise, you're going to be penalized when you have a loss. So if you underinsure it, they're going to prorate your loss payment. And you also can endorse your policy. Remember, most policies, including commercial, will only pay you the actual cash value, which means it's depreciated. So if you have a 40-year-old building, it may be worth less than if you bought a new one, because that's your book value. You can actually add to your policy, I want to have an agreed upon value. Maybe I've had an appraisal done and you review it and you agree that I will insure that piece of property for that dollar amount, because to replace it, it's going to cost that. Or you could have just instead of doing agreed upon, you could just say whatever the replacement cost is at the time of loss, that's what I want coverage for. And you can add in an inflation guard to keep you from having to continually review the values. Okay, there's 3 cause of loss forms with the BPP, meaning you get to pick and choose which one you want. One is cheaper, one's intermediate, and one's the most expensive. We're going to go through all 3 of those. And you get to pick. The first one is basic. This is the cheapest. And under a basic form for BPP, for property coverage, you only have 11 causes of loss. Remember, these are perils that are covered. So peril is the type of loss, what was the cause of the claim. Those 11 include fire, lightning, explosion. You can read them. Flu Saver is the acronym that I put together. It helps me remember if I had to go and recite fire, lightning, explosion, wind, all of those are covered. You can kind of memorize them quickly. I do want you to have a basic understanding of these and try to review them for the quiz, because it's very likely that I would have that list of, is this on a basic form or not? Pretty simple to remember. The next level of coverage is broad. So in addition to these 11, you get 3 more things covered. You get falling objects. Something falls out of the sky, a tree falls and hits your building, that's a falling object. Let's say you have a very heavy snow or ice and it collapses the roof or destroys something inside, that would be covered. Water damage. If you don't have this broad coverage, it wouldn't cover any of those things. It's not listed in one of these 11 coverages. And the last one is a special form. And if you guys recall, that's an all-risk policy, meaning that everything is covered except what is excluded. We call that a special form. It's not called an all-risk. It can be called that, but the terminology that's used in the industry is special form. So remember, we have basic, 11 coverages, broad adds 3 more in addition to the basic, and then you have special, means it covers everything unless you know that it's excluded. Business income. So obviously if you have a fire and you have to shut your doors, and this is a hot topic right now. So right now, businesses have had to close their door during the COVID, and there's a lot of debate and speculation of what's going to end up. A lot of insurance companies are denying business income claims because they're saying communicable disease is not a peril that is covered. So the fact that you had to close your business because of that to protect your workforce or the public, that's not going to count for a business income loss. So essentially what a business income loss is, let's say you have a fire and it is a covered type of loss, and obviously you have to shut your doors. You can't reopen and let people come into the store until you either fix it, repair it, replace the building, buy new merchandise, whatever. So that covers you in the period of time that you're down and out, meaning you don't have the business open. What it would cover is they're actually going to look at your previous business statement. What would I projected to be earning during that period of time? Let's say you're out of business for 6 months if I were projected to make $100,000 in revenue, so income less expense, that's my net income, but I actually had a loss, it's going to look at the difference between those two, and that is your business income loss. That would be considered coverage. Sometimes you actually do have a little bit of income. Maybe you still have online sales, or maybe you reduce some of your expenses. So it looks at everything, you know, what would you have spent, what would you have made, and it looks at what you did actually spend and what you actually did make off of your business, and it looks at the net of those two. So that suspension of operations that's a result of a covered peril is what would be covered. It also is going to cover you if for some reason maybe you don't have a fire, but civil authority has said you cannot open. 9/11 is a great example. You know, right after the event, several businesses that were near Ground Zero were closed. They were not allowed to go back in their buildings because it was in too close proximity, and they were trying to recover the debris and clean up everything. So that would be a potential coverage. Remember, the income loss has to be the direct result of something that is covered. So it's got to be a covered peril. There's also something called extended business income. So let's say you have a fire, you're closed 6 months, you rebuild, you reopen your doors. We all know that income does not go back to what it was right before the loss, especially if you're a business that's like a restaurant, for example. You might have lost patronage. People aren't going to come right back to you if they know you've had a loss. They may not even know you're open. It's going to take time to rebuild your business and recover your lost income. So you can actually add coverage that would give you that extended period of time to get your income back up to where it was. That's still a business income loss. Usually business income stops from the minute you reopen your doors, but having this would give you a little bit more cushion. Some other typical property coverages, and I'm going to throw out 2 or 3 different things. They're not typically covered in a BPP policy. That's what I just covered in those. These are specialty property coverages. The first one being builder's risk. So let's say you're building a brand new facility, something you've never had before. As an example, we built in 2011 a $1.5 billion power plant, and we during the course of the entire project, from beginning the day we broke ground till the day it was operational, there are potentials for risks to occur. You could have loss of equipment. You could have delays in startup because some piece of equipment wasn't working. Any type of risk that could delay the project would be covered under a builder's risk policy. So anything under construction is really good to have. It's also going to cover your general contractors, subcontractors, as well as you as the owner. You usually pay a premium just for that. Another common coverage that people get would be equipment breakdown insurance. So it's not a covered peril. Remember, wear and tear, we've learned that in other policy. You can't just buy, my car broke down because the engine died. This is something you actually have a piece of property, and it really works well in the power plant industry because we have a large power plant. We could have damages, but we also, what if our turbines break down and we can't run them? It means we can't produce power. It means we have to replace it with some power we buy somewhere else, or we lose sales in the market because we can't produce power to sell. So you could actually get coverage for equipment breakdown. So like, you know, your steam boiler or any kind of those large pressure vessels that have those type of losses that have to be inspected and reviewed and make sure that they're actively working. In fact, we have to take down our generators at least once every 18 months to make sure they're all operational, take them apart and rebuild them. It's like an overhaul that you have to do. The last property coverage that I will mention that's real common is called difference in conditions, DIC. Basically, it's an additional all risk policy. So even if you have an all risk policy or special coverage form, sometimes there's still gaps in your coverage. Buying a difference in condition, another term we like to use is called a wrap policy, meaning it takes your coverages, puts a wrap around it and says, I'm going to cover everything that's not covered somewhere else. You do pay additional premium for that, but then that helps guarantee you that if you have that unusual or catastrophic exposure, it will not fall through the cracks. You'll have coverage for it. Another focus I wanted to talk about in this chapter, they talk about transportation insurance, and this is really important if you have large dollar value items that are being transported. I've used this scenario many times. So we have $10 million turbines that have to be sometimes sent back to the manufacturer or a particular vendor that may be on the East Coast. We're going to load that turbine on a tractor trailer, or we're going to load it on a train. We're going to lift it up and set it down. It can be damaged while it's being set on the truck. It could be damaged while it's in transit. You've seen those big wide loads. Or it could be damaged while it's at the vendor. So a lot of people like to have protection for that. Another area that you have a lot of concern, we don't use this anymore. This was created, before the cars were real common, before the 1900s. But ocean marine insurance, basically that protects any goods that are being transported over water, which if we have exports or imports, a lot of those are transported by boat. So those will be covered by an ocean marine policy. There's 3 different types of coverages you can get there. You get hull insurance. Basically that means if anything happens to the hull of the boat or ship, or vessel we call it, that would cover the physical damage to that boat. Another one is the cargo. So if you are a shipper of goods, you're going to probably buy a cargo policy that says anything that I'm shipping, I want it protected, those property items that are physically movable. So if you regularly ship things, you're probably going to want to get a policy. We'll cover that in a minute. And then the last one is kind of a collision policy, or as I would call it, a protection and indemnity insurance. It's basically a liability policy. So let's say you own a ship and you own the boat, you have protection with hull insurance. You probably also want to have coverage for any damages that could have occurred to a third party. Maybe your boat or ship collided with another boat, or maybe someone was damaged or hurt on the boat. Maybe one of your employees, or there's a passenger, like a ship, like a passenger ship. Those things you want to have. That it's basically a liability policy for anything that can be go wrong with a third party. Then we talked about if you are a shipper, you want to probably have coverage for that freight that you're shipping on a regular basis. Inland marine, so we talked about ocean marine, that covers anything that's being shipped on water, and it's not just the ocean. Ocean marine says ocean, but it also covers other bodies of water. So it could be the Mississippi River, could be some inland waterway. Even though it says ocean, it covers anything on water. Inland marine, so you would think mentally, okay, that means it's some body of water that's inland of the ocean. That is not the case. Inland marine protects goods that are shipped on land. Does not make sense. The word marine and land don't make sense together, but that's what it is. This evolved around the turn of the century. There used to be a lot of competition. Most people shipped everything via ships before there were vehicles. And so they had a market, and then all of a sudden there was a competition there. So they created this inland marine type coverage that they all could participate in. Basically, inland marine's definition is any imports or exports or any shipments that you have vehicle via land that could be transported by tractor trailer, train, anything that you're moving on land being shipped from point A to point B would be covered on inland marine. Commercial things that are property that are typically covered on inland marine be things that are in transit. Like I said, us taking a turbine and shipping it back to a vendor, that would be one. If I actually have property that's held by somebody else, like my dry cleaner, that would be covered. Mobile equipment. So I have equipment that isn't an auto. I can't insure something that's not four-wheeled. Maybe it's a track type vehicle. And it's not drivable on the highway. You can't cover that with an auto policy. So your mobile equipment that's really like parked in one location, that would be covered on a transportation or inland marine policy. And then the last thing I would mention is cargo policy. So we talked about if you're a heavy shipper of goods, you either can buy an annual transit policy, which would cover all the shipments that you take, whether it's railroad, truck, vessel, on the coast, any waterway, and make it cover any of your trips for the entire year. Or on the other side, you could buy just one trip only, a trip transit policy. and that's a single shipment. If you hardly ever ship something, that may be what you want to choose rather than buying an annual policy. That's all I have for commercial property. Pretty straightforward. I just want you guys to focus on the type of policies and what is covered, business income, the 3 types of forms, what are the generally things that are covered, and then a little bit about ocean marine and inland marine. Those are the type of things I want you to focus on for the exam. With that, I will talk to you soon, and I will finish up on the last lecture of the semester. See you later. Take care.